is Stephen Gyarmati. I'm a Field Technical Director at Cohesity. Thank you for attending today's webinar. I'd like to introduce Ron Nixon as well, our Field CISO. Ron, do you want to take a little time to introduce yourself?
Yeah, one is thanks for having me, Steve. So yeah, I'm the Field CISO over here at one of the Field CISOs over here at Cohesity. I've been with Cohesity for about 8 or 9 months. I've got a heavy background in the systems integrator space, mostly around cybersecurity, and in about 23 years in the U.S. military, also around cyber operations, which is, and then as a Field CISO, my job is to help bring operational context and security to our customers, to help them understand or figure out better ways to implement products and technology.
Thanks very much, Ron. So the topic of today's webinar is going to be a little bit about how ransomware has evolved within the past year, and especially about how they're using new attack strategies that many companies need to be aware of. And given the increased prevalence of new types of ransomware, we have to look at improving the security posture within the large enterprise. So we're going to be talking about various measures you can take to harden your security posture, as well as institute a virtual air gap architecture to help your company bunker down. So with that being said, Ron, let's cover some of the changes to the ransomware threats within the past year. What are we seeing from bad actors relative to their threat vectors or attack strategies?
So I think to really put it simply, you've seen an increase in sophistication, and so what I mean is, if you go back and if you look at ransomware attacks a few years ago, they really were kind of a smash and grab kind of opportunity. Almost like the jewelry store heist in New York or something like that. But they get into the environment, they encrypt everything, say, give me money, and then they give you keys back, right? But they give you keys to figure out how to decrypt your stuff. But they've altered that because they realize that with the advent of backups and them backups becoming more readily available, they began to change their tactics, and they began spending more time in the space, more, we call it dwell time, which is their time inside of an environment before they get discovered. And that has led to a couple of aspects and changes with that, right? So one is that increase in sophistication, spending more time in the environment. So the trigger for that spending more time in the environment, we've seen this new service develop over the past year and a half, which is initial access as a service, where they actually buy high-level credentials. They buy system administrator credentials into the environment. And then you're also seeing straight ransomware as a service, where you can actually go to somebody like the Conti ransomware group and have them target somebody for you. You throw Bitcoin at them and they pick the target for you, or selling the ransomware technology itself. And then them spending time inside the environment, that does a couple of things. One is it gives them time to actually exfiltrate your data out of the environment. And when they're exfiltrating the data out of the environment, they do it for a couple of reasons. One is because they're using it to assess and figure out what you've got, what's valuable, what's not. But they also use it as a double extortion piece, kind of like the Los Angeles school district, from a month or so ago, or a couple of months ago, where they start actually leaking portions of the data and the information out there to kind of back you into a corner to pay. And then you're also seeing and then from there, while they're in there, they're also destroying your backups, right? They're also eliminating your backups, because a lot of people maintain their backups as part of their normal management architecture and infrastructure. And then the other piece you've seen is a level of sophistication around the supply chain attacks. And so the SolarWinds attack is the one that made a lot of news, because it affected about 18,000 companies. And a lot of those were inside the Department of Defense and the U.S. government. And so it had a real high-profile space. But again, coming back to that dwell time, the bad guys spent a lot of time inside the environment to actually be able to edit product code, so that what was suspected as being a secure, trusted product actually became a compromised product. And the last piece I wanted to add to that, yeah, sorry about that. And the last piece I wanted to add to that is, despite the fact that you're seeing this increase in sophistication, you're still seeing the fact that the bad guys are still able to rely on just bad cyber hygiene, not patching, configuration errors, and stuff like that. So there's still a base level of stuff that's not being done to allow them access.
Got it. So it sounds like some things have stayed the same, but there's been evolution in the bad actors' capabilities overall. So with that in mind, what do CISOs need to be doing when they're hardening their security posture today?
So there's a couple of things with that, right? So people have kind of heard me say this a little bit, and I like to paraphrase Sun Tzu, and maybe it's the military background, right? So paraphrasing Sun Tzu, know yourself, know your enemy, know your terrain, right? And so one is you have to understand what data and information you have and how your architecture protects that, right? And so that kind of helps you understand the blast radius, the amount of damage that can be done in your environment, right? Especially from because ransomware in many ways is not necessarily targeted. It goes and finds and encrypts, but if you can quarantine that, through some zero trust capabilities or through good, robust data management and data security aspects, role-based access controls and things like that, immutability, then you can control some of that blast radius, that damage. And then you've got to make sure that you're protecting your backup infrastructure and architecture itself, right? You got to make sure that the stuff you're relying on to be available in the event of a cyber attack or even a natural disaster is actually available in the event, right? So again, coming back to identity and access management, role-based access controls, and the ability to build a robust architecture. And then identifying what information and data you have to protect in order to protect yourself. And I'm meaning so things that could be reputationally damaged and damage not your reputation, but your relationship with your customers. PII, PCI information, HIPAA data, things like that, where, it being compromised affects more than just your ability to do business. It actually impacts somebody's willingness to do business with you. And the last piece is we begin to talk about this because we're really, today we're talking about, backup and recovery and air gapping and stuff like that. Kind of the focus for today is, does your ability to recover match your speed of operations? For instance, there was a 6.4 magnitude earthquake in Northern California, right? And so that has a pretty large damage area. So if you're doing physical backups of tape and drives, how close is that? Is the area where that was stored, was that damaged? Can you still access that from a physical natural disaster standpoint? And so, is the recovery mechanism itself fast enough to meet your business operations? If you have something that needs to get up in 24 hours or 10 hours, can that backup system and recovery apparatus actually do that?
Yeah, that's certainly one of the themes we're hearing from many of our customers and prospects is that speed of recovery is very important. Understanding how long it will take to recover key workloads in the event of a disaster, because backup is important, but recovery is even more important in the event of a cyber attack. So the next aspect I want to cover is we recently heard an announcement from the New York Department of Financial Services that they're amending their cybersecurity requirements. And these requirements apply to financial institutions in the state, including many of the large financial customers that I have the opportunity to work with. One of these specific aspects that they call out is air gapping backup data. So with that in mind, how can organizations that don't already have an air gap plan to implement one?
So one is, again, kind of taking an assessment. So coming back to knowing yourself, looking at the data and information that you have available and what is it? Because sometimes it's not practical to air gap everything, right? So knowing and understanding which critical air gaps you can. And then back to the example before, is a physical air gap really practical for you? It's slow, it's cumbersome. You're literally talking about moving tapes and drives back into an environment to be able to restore. And then it's not a practical application for something that is that you really need to, you can't have a large gap in your backup. Can you really back that up every 24 hours or every 8 hours, for something that's critical? And so then you start looking at things like virtual and digital air gapping, right? And then, and so sometimes you can contain that within your environment space. But the problem you have within your environment space is that if the bad guys are inside your environment and they're spending dwell time inside that environment, they're spending those resources to enumerate your environment and your network, then odds are they've probably figured out where those are at. And if they're working off of system administrator access and controls, odds are you're only protecting that with a username, password, or a single account has equal access to it as every other system administrator account, right? And so that identity and access management controls, do you have some type of group type authentication where I can say that more than one person is required to get access to this? And then the air gapping aspect yourself, cloud air gapping is really powerful in an environment like this, right? Where I'm using a cloud provider like Amazon or Azure or Google, where I'm parking my virtual air gap out in that space because now I have regional access to it, right? I would actually have to have a cloud provider's entire region to fall off, before I didn't have access to my backups anymore. And then you're also moving at the speed of network, right? I can pull from that environment at the speed that the network allows me to do. And in a real pinch, I may be able to actually increase my bandwidth to be able to recover faster. And so I think when you're looking at those aspects, I think that those are some of the areas that become really important.
Yeah, it's a great point. Everyone likes the concept of an air gap, but on-premise can be difficult to operationally implement that because of all the environmental prereqs you need to think about, like network, like core services, DNS, NTP, all these things needed to power your isolated recovery environment. If we had a way of providing the same functionality as a cloud-based solution as a service, it really would simplify the deployment. So it's a great point. Now, thinking about, go ahead.
Yeah, and I just wanted to mention that, right? So and we've seen that with our customers around Fort Knox, which is our virtual air gap piece, right? That cloud extensibility, that elasticity of the cloud, the fact that it's always available and it's always regionally available. Those are some of the aspects they key in on. And anyway, those are some of the aspects that really become important to them. That flexibility, that cloud flexibility becomes really important in that space.
Great. So when a CISO is looking for an air gap solution and they're comparing vendors on the market, what are some of the key aspects that they need to be looking for?
So first aspect is I like, so network isolation is important, right? So we talked about the fact that if they're inside of your environment, they're inside of your space, they've spent time, they understand what's going on in there. And then the management isolation comes into contact with it. So the network isolation, separate environment, maybe different routing protocols, different switching protocols. If it's cloud-based, you're already kind of doing that because it's sitting on a cloud infrastructure. And then the management isolation piece too is, making sure that you don't want every admin in your environment, in your space, to have access to that virtual air gapping space, right? You got to make sure you control those. And then you tying that with good multi-factor authentication, which is really the default, should be the default, but then good role-based access controls, looking at a transition to attribute-based access controls potentially. And then looking at, and I talked about this multi-person authentication or auditing process, right? So we have a functionality in our products called Quorum, which means that I can take Ron and Steve and some other person and actually create a quorum for access, right? So I have a 2 of 3, a 3 of 3, a 5 of 7, whatever it is I need to. But that does a really unique thing because it forces the bad guys to compromise more than one account. I can't get there if I'm just compromising Ron Nixon's account. I've got to compromise Steve and maybe even somebody else. Inside the modern data management, data security aspects, immutability is almost table stakes, but it is extremely important. The data should not be able to be deleted, modified, moved in that environment and space. Encryption is a given, but not just at rest, but also while in flight. While it's being moved. The ability to detect ransomware. Are you using things like artificial intelligence, machine learning to look at anomalous behavior in the environment? Is Steve going back and editing a bunch of files at 3 o'clock in the morning from Thailand or something, right? But also looking at, so ransomware depends on encryption, right? Or mass deletion or corruption, right? And so are you looking for those types? Are you looking at entropy and file health and those types of things inside of the environment? and oh, by the way, can you also take that and feed it up to your SIM or your SOAR? So you have third-party extensibility tied in so that you can actually begin to react real time or correlate that with other indicators of compromise. Can I look at network traffic or the administrator database, Active Directory, or whatever? Can I correlate some of that? And then the ease of operations. A lot of times for some of this capability that we're talking about requires multiple tools to be able to do this. And if you are stuck, if you have a platform that doesn't integrate all of this seamlessly, then do those tools integrate seamlessly or near seamlessly, right? So I think ease of operations should, especially when you're talking about, this is a bad spot for a company to be in or any organization to be in. There's a lot of panic going on, and people, I don't care how, I've seen this a number of times, I don't care how experienced you are as a data management or a data recovery specialist, when the crap really hits the fan, things break down. And so having a system that allows you to do that easily is really, really important.
It's a good point you raised about being a good citizen within the overall security framework that the customer has in place. What tools are there in terms of SIEM and SOAR tools, and how can this air gap solution integrate with those easily? So one thing we often hear is that a customer might already have perimeter security in place, and that could mean a firewall, an antivirus, a malware scanner, maybe even an intrusion detection system, and perhaps endpoint security. But what is the value that a backup vendor brings when you already have all these different security tools on the floor in the cyber resilience context?
So you start first with most of these attacks, especially ransomware attacks, or if you look at the aspects around insider threat, some of them, there's some commonalities from a function standpoint that are there, right? They're user initiated. And so you're talking about somebody who's already trusted inside your environment. It's the ability to get somebody to pick up a phone, answer an email, click on a bad link, right, for that initial access. For the beginnings of that initial access. And so you're bypassing a lot of that, right? And APTs, the advanced persistent threat guys, the guys who are really, really good at this, the guys who are really good at staying in your environment without you knowing about it, because that's what they do. They like backups and archives, right? They like living in that space because it's a quieter environment, if you will, right? If you look at your production environment, you got XDR and EDR and antivirus and all of these aspects. I mean, now you're even looking at, the day-to-day use of somebody while they're a remote office. So you've got all of these things looking at user behaviors, looking at data and applications. So it's really noisy up there. And if I am operating as a hostile actor against an organization, I want a quiet space to operate at. And so those are some of the things that I think that begin to look at that. And ransomware in itself has become more complex. And so there are methodologies for getting around some of your more traditional malware-based approaches or signature-based services. And it's not that there's not value in those, but you just have to think about looking at your environment holistically. And most of that stuff is really concentrated on the production space, or is reliant on known intelligence in order to react to a threat.
Sure. Yeah. I think a good way to think about it is you always want that gold copy of last resort. If all your other tools fail, all your other security measures fail, what will you rely on in a last-ditch effort to recover the environment? And this is where backup vendors play. So as backup vendors build out their capabilities in the space, there's a focus on looking within the data set to know more about what type of attack might have occurred. Is the data clean from a prior recovery point? And might data exfiltration have occurred? So could you speak a little bit about those capabilities and where backup vendors are going to be going in the next few years?
Yeah, so artificial intelligence, machine learning is a big aspect of that, right? So your ability to understand what's happening. And then the other piece to that is, and so we talked about that a little bit, like looking at the entropy in anomalous behaviors and activities. And so that's important. And then your ability to integrate that with your SIM and your SOAR to be able to push that up. So that third-party extensibility, that third-party integration becomes super important. And in understanding, right, are you able to actually see and understand what's been exfiltrated and how much of it's been exfiltrated, and in what has, and in is that data either sensitive to your business operations or sensitive to your customer base, right? We talked about that, maintaining a relationship with your customer. And then the other two things I would add is, are you able to scan that data, to make sure that what is still in that space is clean, right? You put it into backups, it was clean when you're bringing it back out. And I would also caveat that with some type of sandboxing capability. Can I spin up an image, a VM, and test it and beat on it to make sure that it is still what it's supposed to be? Is it still intact? Can I still use that archive VM? And the other piece I would say also is the ability to search within your backups and your archives. How far down can I get that? A lot of vendors tend to package everything up, tarball everything up into a package, right? But, and that doesn't allow you to necessarily be able to search all the way down. How far can I actually use a common language search to figure out what's in my space? I think those are some, I think those were some of the areas where I would be looking.
Sure. Yeah. So as we're conducting security workshops with some of our customers, and there's some common themes and things that are often overlooked when we're planning for a cyber event. What are some of these things in your experience that people fail to think about when they're preparing?
So coming back to the last question, kind of like what I talked about a little bit, that ability to spin up the resources, that object, that file, and look at it and test it and play with it. So a clean room, for lack of a better term, is, is this, can I spin this up? Am I still isolated and protected when I spin this up? And can I test it? Can I actually do forensic analysis against it? Things like that. And then speed of recovery becomes super important. Is my speed of recovery, does it make business sense? If I have an application that is updating, with customer data every few minutes, can I afford to be down for 24 hours or weeks on end, right? Colonial Pipeline is a really good example of that, where the CEO for Colonial Pipeline had to sit in front of Congress and say, why did you pay the ransom? Well, I paid the ransom, or Colonial Pipeline paid the ransom, paraphrasing, not quoting, but paraphrasing. We didn't understand the depth and scope of the compromise, and we could not recover fast enough in order to get, natural gas and oil flowing again. And so speed of recovery and matching that to your business operations. And then the last piece is that recovery location again, right? So we talked about that natural disaster. If you're in Florida or in Georgia or Louisiana, you've got to worry about hurricanes that cut a 400-mile wide swath across the state. So if you're dealing with physical backups, or if you're dealing with an offsite backup, is that offsite backup also in the path of the hurricane or tornado or earthquake? So the physical location becomes really important. And again, coming back to that cloud-based aspect, that might make more sense for especially very sensitive, very critical data that you can't wait on.
Sure. Yeah. Especially when it comes to an isolated recovery environment, it's often an architecture that needs to be put together. It's not really productized in every instance. So there might need to be a workshop with the security team where you identify what can you use as a recovery target and what does the recovery workflow need to look like within that environment. It's an exercise that every organization needs to go through.
And you hit
I
on
want to change.
I want to hit on this real quick though, because you put on a really good point. They have to exercise this stuff. Like, all the technology in the world does you no good if you're not exercising this. Even if you offload to a third party organization, like, you've got to integrate with them. You've got to exercise this, even if it's around the lunch table of, hey, what would you do? What would you do? It's really important to exercise this. So I wanted to interrupt you for that one, because that's really important.
Yeah, it's a great point. So now I want to pivot to something a little bit different, and that is cyber insurance. So we're seeing a lot of organizations begin to acquire, solicit cyber insurance. And what they're finding is that these cyber insurance vendors ask very specific and pointed questions about the backup capabilities to determine if the company is insurable, and if so, for how much. So how could a CISO prepare for a cyber insurance questionnaire?
So a couple of things you can expect in there, right? One of the things you can definitely expect is they're going to ask about multi-factor authentication. They're going to ask about PII, and they're going to ask about encryption. Like those are not to overuse the term table stakes. Those are table stakes, right? The things you're also beginning to see on that is integration with SIM, vulnerability management. Those pieces are in there. And again, kind of playing in on the New York Department of Financial Services, you're starting to see offline and air gap, immutability. Those things are in there. You're starting to see those things in there as well, because the insurance company wants to make sure that if they're insuring you, that you have some ability to recover, because they're not just insuring you for like physical damage, like when you damage your car. They're also insuring you for like the equivalent of loss of time off work. If I do wreck my car, also, by the way, who's going to cover my paycheck while I'm out, kind of thing. So if you think about it in those aspects, they begin to look at not just the actual damage from a ransomware attack or a cyber attack, but also the damage that can be done to the organization or business.
Yeah, ideally, the organization isn't going to be vetting out these security capabilities the first time when they're performing this insurance questionnaire. So definitely worth it to do your due diligence ahead of time. All right. And last question, Ron, and more of a softball question here, but as a field CISO, what are some aspects of data security that really keep you up at night? What are customers, what are CISOs in the industry failing to think about?
So I don't know. So I won't say failing to think about, because I think it probably different things run across everybody's minds at different times. You end up with budget constraints. And so I think the first part is coming back to the Sun Tzu aspect, right? So we talked about kind of, even though we didn't key on it, but knowing yourself and knowing your terrain, which is knowing your business operations, and knowing what your environment looks like, so you know what to protect and know what not to protect. I think one of the things that people kind of underplay a lot is understanding the actual threat, knowing the enemy. And they really kind of sell these guys and gals on the bad guy side short. There is a level of sophistication out there that they don't truly appreciate. I mean, the ransomware group, they're looking at an organization's 10K before they figure out how much to ransom them for. They're looking at your financials, they're looking at your profit margins and going, oh, XYZ company can afford 1, 2, 3 amount of money. And so really selling short on that level of sophistication that they're dealing with. And then the last aspect, I think, is getting overly comfortable with where you're at today, right? So I've been using this backup capability for the last 10 or 15 years. So it's worked for me now, so it'll probably work for me then. Well, yeah, the backup's been working for the last 10 or 15 years, but how much of your business has gone cloud-based? How much of your interactions with your customers has now become digital? And how much of that can you lose, in the event of a ransomware attack or a cyber attack, so because that's the basis for your recovery, is how much risk are you willing to accept and how much can you actually lose before it impacts your business? And then you kind of work backwards from there. And so I think that underselling of the bad guys, and that maybe not quite taking into account that my backups and my archivings and those types of things may be a little more dated than they need.
Thanks for that, Ron. And with that, looks like we're just about at time. But thanks very much for joining us today for this discussion about air gapping and data security in general. We at Cohesity would love to have a discussion with your security teams regarding some of our air gapping and data classification capabilities as well. So please do reach out if that's of interest. With that, I'll turn it back over. Thanks very much.